Welcome everybody to this Wednesday afternoon live stream. This one, another episodic or event-driven conversation focused on the wildfire situation, especially in Southern California, which escalated pretty dramatically yesterday, and also the fire currently burning southwest of Reno, the Davis fire. We'll talk about that in the context of a rather significant major wind event that's currently unfolding and look at what's happening up there. Just a reminder that this channel is sponsored by Climate Tech Reask, a company that is helping organizations to better quantify and manage extreme weather risk in a warming world. So today, as I mentioned, the focus is going to be on the possibility that yesterday's blow-ups on the Southern California fires could be repeated later this afternoon and this evening with an increasing wind event, and also just to overview what happened yesterday because it was a pretty extraordinary sequence of events. For context, anybody who lives in Southern California probably doesn't need reminding of this, but the most recent 10 or 11 day period, with the exception of yesterday with a bit of a cool down along the coast, although it was still hot inland, featured record-breaking heat throughout Southern California, not just in the mountains, not just in the deserts, but all the way to the coast and at all elevations. And this helped set the stage for a period of explosive wildfire growth and behavior over the past several days from ignitions that occurred several days prior. The heat wave was capped off toward the end by very moist and unstable conditions. So thunderstorms developed. The fires that were already burning at the time developed their own fire thunderstorm-like clouds, pyrocumulonimbus clouds, and that stormy weather pushed the fires erratically in different directions. Yesterday, we didn't see pyrocumulonimbus clouds for the most part, except perhaps a localized one in the evening on the bridge fire. But what we did see was plume-dominated pyrocumulus behavior. So these are fire-generated plumes that are a little bit shallower, but can be just as dangerous and problematic from a firefighting and fire spread perspective. These fires actually took advantage of the fact that there was less cloud cover, there were no scattered showers associated with those thunderstorms, and the winds, instead of being quite stagnant for most of the very hot period this past weekend, started to pick up yesterday, and as a result, a lot of these fires started to run uphill. Now, this was an onshore wind, so mostly a west to east or a southwest to northeast wind, as opposed to an offshore wind. So this was not a Santa Ana wind event, and it wasn't particularly extreme. We're talking winds of 10 to 20 miles an hour, locally 30 miles an hour, with gusts of 30, maybe locally up to 40 miles an hour yesterday. That is not a particularly extreme event by Southern California standards by any means, even for an onshore wind event. Those are modest winds, but given that there were a lot of fires in some pretty precarious locations, wrong place, wrong time, and also immediately following two sort of a 1-2 punch, two consecutive pieces that made conditions as explosive as they became. One is the antecedent context of 2 consecutive very wet years in Southern California, which, as we know from research and from history, wet conditions in Southern California can yield much above average growth of grass and brush, known as herbaceous fuels. And indeed, in some places, herbaceous fuel loading was 50 to 100% above typical values this year because there was so much additional growth over the past 2 years from all of that extra moisture. Now, while that means that we're not in a drought and don't have that kind of fire risk to deal with, when we have all that extra vegetation and when we kiln dry it effectively with a record-breaking heat wave for 7 to 10 days, as we just experienced, that's a recipe for some pretty extreme fire behavior, and that's when the winds arrive, and that's unfortunately just what we saw with some of these fires hung up in drainages, that when the onshore winds came, even though they're not particularly dry winds, the vegetation was so dry and temperatures still hot enough that these fires took off like gangbusters. Yesterday there were 3 really big fires that made runs, major runs, and yesterday all of those major runs on all 3 fires, the bridge fire, the line fire and the airport fire all unfortunately destroyed a number of structures. So there was significant structural loss on all three fires. I don't think the numbers are officially in, but it looks like it could be as high as the high dozens cumulatively yesterday. That's quite serious. It's quite unfortunate. It's also not as bad as it could have been, and I'll talk a little bit about that, particularly in the Wrightwood area, where there were neighborhoods and subdivisions that lost quite a few homes last night, but most of the town was not lost, and that was a very real possibility as recently as midnight last night, when this fire front made it all the way into town proper. There were also some homes lost yesterday on Mount Baldy area. But again, crews are otherwise occupied trying to prevent more losses, and so I don't think there's an official tally yet, but it's quite clear that there was on the order of dozens, potentially on the order of dozens for each of those fires yesterday when these fires made their aggressive upslope run. So these are three different patches of Southern California, also I believe 3 different counties that experienced these losses on these 3 different fires. So yesterday was extraordinary, partly for the footage. Whenever there's a major wildfire in Southern California these days, it's well documented. There's lots of people who live there, of course. It's the news helicopter center of the universe, if you will. There's also the fire stringers that go out there, drive around capturing footage, sometimes broadcasting in real time. There were some folks who were live streaming from the Angeles Crest Highway last night near Wildwood as the fire crested the ridge. Some pretty dramatic footage there. And we also now have these alert cameras, these fire situational awareness, essentially, devices, just keeping an eye on the landscape. You can follow these cameras for free online. They update every few seconds. And Santiago Peak, down on the airport fire, featured a pretty dramatic burnover in which at least one of the cameras, as far as I could tell, was inside of a substantial fire whirl. So swirling flames enveloped the camera. Kind of amazingly, that camera actually remains online. So whoever built that, congratulations on having your alert cameras survive the fire whirl there and the overall flame front, which came quite aggressively through. There was some damage up there, but it seems a lot of those cameras remained online. More consequentially, though, is that as the airport fire in Orange County continued its south and eastward run yesterday, it did jump the highway through the mountains there, and in the suburbs to the west of Lake Elsinore, there were a number of structures lost as that fire burned through subdivisions. It's not quite clear what the toll is there, but it sounds like it could have been fairly substantial. On the line fire, which is the one I believe that has been burning the longest, and yet is not the largest fire, so it hasn't had the most rapid rate of spread, there were apparently a few structures lost up in the mountains near Running Springs yesterday, but not as extensive of structural loss as had earlier been feared, and also not nearly as widespread as on the other 2 fires. So the fire did make a run up toward Running Springs, although it didn't make it too far into town. The bigger problem on the line fire is the northern and eastern flank of the fire, and that's the one that's heading towards Big Bear, Big Bear area, and there are evacuation warnings currently in effect for all of Big Bear, and now I believe some mandatory orders starting to go out for the southwest portion of the region, so the closest part to the fire. I'll show all of this on maps in just a minute, but just wanted to get the top line stuff out there. But I'm reserving the most kind of astonishing bits for last. That's the bridge fire, which yesterday morning I believe was about a 3,000 acre fire, so not terribly large by contemporary standards, but it's now likely over a 50,000 acre fire. So between essentially over a 48-hour period, or really a 36-hour period, that fire has run the better part of 50,000 acres. And that's very different than seeing a 50,000 acre run, say, in grasslands. So when we saw the initial spread on the Park Fire in Northern California earlier this summer under extreme burning conditions up there, It was, in its initial hours, primarily grass and brush fire and chewed through its first 100,000 acres very quickly. That's still really fast, but it's more understandable that a fire can burn through under extremely dry and windy conditions 50, 80, 100,000 acres of grass, because that is a fuel type that burns very quickly and can afford a fire a very easy way to chew through a very large area quite quickly. That is the nature of grass fires in that setting. But the bridge fire was burning through vastly different conditions, far more complex terrain, some of the steepest mountains in North America, in fact, in the vicinity of Mount Baldy, and in the San Gregorio Mountains. And so, what we have is this fire that managed to explode from several thousand acres to 50 or more thousand acres. So essentially a tenfold increase in size just yesterday in extraordinarily steep and complex terrain. So this means the fire had to go up mountainsides, burn downslope, jump across valleys, burn across new ridges, and then make it downslope again at least 2 other times in effectively one burning period. And it did so in a setting of mixed brush and also really heavy timber. So this is not a grass fire. This is burning through much heavier fuels. It usually takes much longer for fires to travel equivalent distances when they are forest fires versus grass fires under equivalent conditions and in extremely steep terrain versus, say, relatively flat grassland with a wind on it. So that made it all the more remarkable that the fire ran about 13 or 14 linear miles yesterday, burning essentially from one side of the mountains to the other. The fire is now in the high desert and has apparently burned some structures. I believe it's near Pinyon Hills. So I believe it's out by excuse me. Yeah, I think it's the Pinyon Hills. I'll look at the map when I show it to folks later. So that's an incredible run in terms of acres per day and even measuring it in miles per hour. If it ran 14 miles in about 12 hours, well, that's pretty hard to get out of the way. And keep in mind, if you're on the Angeles Crest Highway, it's a very, very windy, fairly remote mountain road with some towns along it, ski resorts, etc. And it's not a quick in or out. So the crow flies a lot more directly than the car drives or the fire engine drives in that context. So this was one challenge, as the fire made a rapid beeline for the Wildwood area, and there's some dramatic footage that was live at the time yesterday of the ski areas above Wrightwood, which saw this huge fire front come through, well documented with all these cameras. They were running their snowmaking machines, which of course wasn't producing snow at these temperatures, but was producing a fine mist in hopes of saving some of the infrastructure, which it looks like they were at least partially successful. So there was damage there, but I don't think it was a total loss, and that may be partly due to the fact that the regions under the chairlifts acted as a bit of fire breaks, and also the snowmaking equipment was able to protect, I think, some of the main structures there. But this fire, the evacuation orders for this fire were ordered kind of late, honestly, to be totally transparent, relative to what we would typically expect in this moment. So there was a bit of a frenzied evacuation of the Wrightwood area. Fortunately, there is a clear egress route away from the fire zone into the high desert that I think most folks used. But this was also an event that was not expected to be at the Wrightwood area as quickly as it was. This fire moved extraordinarily fast across very complex terrain, did things that even the seasoned fire officials weren't really anticipating, although if you look at fire history in the region and the extreme ambient burning conditions from the very heavy fuel loading from all that moisture plus the record heat wave that preceded it, perhaps it was foreseeable. But in any case, this was a rapid evacuation scenario for Wildwood, not a lot of warning. And the fire did move into the western side of Wildwood last night and burn structures on the west side of town primarily. It's remarkable that more of Wildwood didn't burn last night, frankly. If the winds had been a little bit stronger, or if there had been slightly fewer firefighting resources, I think that most of Wildwood probably would have been toast. As it is, again, there is significant structural loss on the west side of town, but this was not As some folks had expressed some concerns, this was not a paradise situation. This was not a situation where lots of people weren't able to get out or where the whole town was destroyed, fortunately. So it's not a good outcome, but it's definitely a lot better than some of the outcomes that could have occurred with a very fast-moving, high-intensity, wind-driven fire approaching a town in the mountains in a relatively inaccessible area without a whole lot of warning. So given that context, this went better than it could have. Town is not completely out of the woods yet. In fact, the fire is actively burning around the other side of town right now, but there is more warning. There's more resources in place right now. So that's the Wildwood story. The fire has burned all the way into the high desert. So this is from the coastal side of Mount Baldy all the way into the desert in one day. That is what is so remarkable about that pace. And it's not that fires can't burn from one side of the mountains to the other in Southern California. There's certainly a history for that. But it's the fact it did it in one day, and effectively in one burning period, as it's called. That rate of spread and rate of linear spread and aerial burning is pretty incredible, and was facilitated by the extremeness of the antecedent conditions that came before. And then the other fire of interest is actually not in California. It's in far western Nevada, south and west of Reno. That is... comment from folks. I think I transitioned from saying Wildwood from Wrightwood. What I mean is Wrightwood. Wrightwood is the town affected. Apologies for that. The Davis fire is the other one of concern up by south and west of Reno. The Weather Service in Reno, for the first time since 2019, issued a particularly dangerous situation red flag warning. This is an elevated red flag warning that they don't issue every day, or as is apparent from that statistic, not even every year, so it's unusual. Because wind gusts of up to 60 or 70 miles an hour downslope pushing the fire in the direction of the South Reno suburbs are now developing as we speak. Now, this is a bit of a nail biter because there's a fire in a really bad location, but firefighters have had a couple days to put in some line. There have been aircraft, which aircraft are off the fire now because it's too windy, so they can't help today. But the good work that was done in the days preceding might be enough to prevent this fire from blowing into South Reno. But it is going to be a nail biter, and I haven't checked the web cameras in a while, so I'll take a look at those live in a moment. But this had the potential to be a really bad scenario for the suburbs of South Reno, and that remains on the table. There were actually the evacuations were expanded in the region specifically for this wind event, which will probably be over by tomorrow, but there could be a good 12 hours of very strong winds, and they're just ramping up now. So I'll take a look at what that looks like, and if we're lucky, it doesn't look like much. It didn't this morning, but this with winds that strong and with a fire in a known bad location, it's going to do its damnedest to flare up. That's a lot of oxygen on this thing, so we'll see what happens. We'll take a look in a moment. So I think it's time probably to share some imagery. So you're going to see me share my screen. As always, it might get an infinite mirror for a moment first. Okay, so the first thing I want to show, let's see here. That's the wrong window here. Okay, this is the window I wanted to show. All right, so this is the current Storm Prediction Center. By the way, this is the center that does fire weather prediction at national scales in the U.S. You can see that almost all of Nevada and parts of eastern California, as well as Utah, are under critical fire risk today. The western fringe of this is, of course, where the Davis fire is near Reno. Locally elevated fire conditions in Southern California near the Bridge Fire. I'll talk about that in a moment. But that national scale, that doesn't show up. If we look at tomorrow, this risk zone shifts eastward into the Front Range. Oh boy, that'll be fun here in Boulder tomorrow. But the conditions do calm down tomorrow. So I think especially on the Davis fire, if we can get through today without a huge blow up, I think that one will be in relatively good shape. But if we look at, in fact, let's just go to that right now, and you'll see not a lot of fire activity apparent right now on the satellite imagery in Northern California and Western Nevada. In fact, I'm not even sure you can see the Davis fire right now. It's roughly in this vicinity, where my cursor is, not really any thermal signature, so nothing to see right now, but I'll show you the webcams, and we can take a look later. All right, and here's Southern California, where the ongoing fire activity is a little more apparent. It's definitely not as dramatic as yesterday, so that's some good news. Let me get rid of these old circles from yesterday. But there is still quite a bit going on. So the least active fire, although you can still see it, this is the whoops, that's not the tool I wanted here. The airport fire in Orange County, that's down here. You can still see some smoke, but it's not nearly as dramatic. The most active fire right now actually looks like it's the line fire, which is different than it had been before. That had been the quieter one in recent days. This one looks like it's now making a run in the easterly direction towards Big Bear, so as I mentioned, that's going to be a problem. And then also very active already today is the bridge fire. You can see that there's a very large perimeter emitting smoke, and that smoke is now starting to blow to the east. Strong winds along the mountain desert axis right here are likely to blow for the rest of the day. In fact, they could get up to 40 or 50 miles an hour later this afternoon, this evening. You can kind of start to see that happening now. If you look at the direction of flow of the smoke in this plume right now, it is starting to pick up. So I would expect, in particular, the bridge fire and the line fire to really pick up in intensity later today, and there is a red flag warning in effect for that. The airport fire might do so as well, but that's a little bit farther away from the strong wind zone. So right now, today, these are the two fires of big primary concern in Southern California. And if I bring up the thermal signature, I think this tells, well, it's not as dramatic as it was yesterday either, but I think that it tells a bigger story about what's going on here. Look how large the active hot perimeter of the this is the bridge fire is. That entire zone is actively on fire. So that's a pretty darn big footprint, all of the black area. In the case of the line fire, this is the area where you can see active flames today, and that might pick up later. And then with the airport fire, it's smaller, but you can still see it. That's sort of the outline here. So these are still very large and active fires, and they're likely to pick up in activity later today. Actually looks like there might be a new fire up here somewhere popping up on the late imagery, so we'll have to check that out on watch duty. Take a look. Okay, I'm going to bring this back. So if I do go over to watch duty, okay, there is that fire. It's called the Joshua fire. Let's see. It's small, it's 3 acres, but it is running and it is very windy. So where is this? It's in a pretty remote spot, but this could be potentially a challenge. Let's see if there's any cameras on it now. There it is. This is the brand new one. So again, you can see it's relatively small. It looks like it's in the grass and burning in the grass and brush. But you can see those winds pushing it to the right of the camera. That's going to push it potentially upslope. So it'd be interesting to see how this one evolves. Keep an eye on that one. But of course, of more concern right now are the 3 really big fires. I'll start with the one that's the least active today, the airport fire. You can see how it's the most recent activity it's on the eastern flank. This fire has made it almost all the way to Lake Elsinore, so within a few blocks of the lake itself, actually, locally. Most of the structural losses I'm aware of were in this region of the fire, so I don't know the details, but the fire is still most active on this front. If we take a look, go west a bit, there is still some activity up by the peak. Here are the communication site that survived the burnover yesterday. You can see some fire retardant slurry there. Some activity up there, but the main spread at this point is down here, and you can see that's where the bulk of the evacuations are. Some pretty broad evacuations extending well past Lake Elsinore, all the way down. I think this is the I-15 corridor down to the south and east, and all the way north in the Temescal Canyon area. But this fire looking okay for the moment. It's still active, and there's still definitely risk on the eastern flank. But I think the bigger concern at this point are these 2 fires, given the wind event this afternoon and evening. I'll zoom in on, this is the line fire first, and one thing that's remarkable is there are evacuation warnings all the way from Lake Arrowhead area, and even west of there, even including the Crestline area for this fire, and also evacuation warnings and orders all the way out to Big Bear, and again even well east of Big Bear Lake itself, including Big Bear City and really up into the wilderness to the northeast. So this is a huge area. It's not contiguous because there aren't people who live in all of these zones, but if you look, essentially this is the area encompassed by evacuation order or warnings from this line fire. That is an enormous area. It includes a lot of mountain communities in the San Bernardino Mountains. So again, what you can see, I think, which is quite apparent, is that this fire is pretty cool now. I don't think there's really much threat down in the Highland area, so there are still some evacuation warnings, but my guess is that these may be lifted sooner rather than later. Not so, though, on the northern and eastern flank of the fire. This is the part of the fire that's really active. As I mentioned, Running Springs still at risk, but probably not as much at risk now as Big Bear. So this is sort of the flank that's of concern, and it is moving in this direction. So the southwestern half of the Big Bear area is definitely at risk as soon as today, in the next few hours. This box is potentially in the crosshairs. So unfortunately, I don't have great news, and it looks like there's evacuations even down here for the line fire. So again, this is a large area. I don't think Lake Arrowhead, Running Springs are going to be at as much risk. In fact, it's possible Lake Arrowhead area sees a downgrade soon. But the Big Bear area, this is sort of where my main concern is right now. And there's a lot of people who live in that area. Okay, so if I now go over to the bridge fire. Okay, so one thing I want to emphasize is again just how enormous the evacuation area is for this fire. It extends all the way from the far northern fringes of the urban corridor here in the valley. I was going to sort of roughly draw the whole region where these evacuation orders are in effect. Again, that's a huge fraction of the San Gregorio Mountains, including most of the Angeles National Forest, all of Wrightwood, pretty much all of the Angeles Crest Highway in there, all the way out into the high desert. And there are actually evacuations orders even all the way into the desert. Now, the fuel type changes. There's not contiguous pine forest here. It's grass and brush, but in this wind-driven environment, this fire could be pushed well into the high desert where there is continuous vegetation. So again, this is a really large region as well. And if you combine this with the evacuation region for the line fire, I think most of the major communities in the mountains of the transverse ranges in Southern California are currently under evacuation warnings or orders for one of these two fires. That is a pretty remarkable statistic. Somebody with the geospatial props could do that. So as you can see, there's a lot of active fire line. You can kind of see that from satellite. There's not really a clear front. This whole blob has burned in the last 12 hours, so there's still active fire everywhere. But I think the biggest concern at this point is this front of the fire because, as I mentioned, we're seeing movement of the fire primarily in this direction today because of the strong winds that are developing. So that does mean that the parts of Wildwood that have not burned at this point are still at risk, although I think given that firefighting resources have now had time to prepare in this region, I think hopefully things will go all right. But there are, again, high desert communities at risk. There is still a limitation of resources available, so that's a significant concern down there. And again, this area is currently in a red flag warning because of the winds today and tonight. Let's check on this new fire, the Joshua fire. Still, it's 50 acres, so it's getting larger. Let's see if we can see it on the camera again. Okay, that's still cooking. Come back to that at the end of our conversation, see what's going on. But again, there are evacuations on the bridge fire all the way from the Inland Empire, essentially almost all the way to Lake Los Angeles in the desert, which is pretty remarkable. Okay, other fires of lesser note at this point. Let's go take a look at the Davis fire. This is again the one that's currently threatening the southern suburbs of Reno. A few things to point out here. This is the footprint of the fire from the past several days. But notice that the only recent hotspot detections are actually back towards the west side of the fire. So this is where the forested part of what the fire is burning is. Down here it's more grass and brush. This is where there was structural loss earlier, and there's subdivisions here. But this, unfortunately, this is concern. This portion of the fire is of a concern because you're going to have winds, and you have winds right now that are blowing like this. So you can imagine that that's why there are substantial evacuations in effect for the suburbs a little bit further north as well. So if we take a look at the most recent update, there's not anything specific here. Sounds like there's a plea for residents to stop using as much water, which suggests there might be some issues with water supply for the firefight. Here's the live camera view, looking toward the fire. So obviously it's still burning, and you can tell where the wind is coming from. So the wind is blowing downslope in this direction. So as you can see, there's lots of trees intermixed. There's wildland-urban interface, wildland-urban intermix in this region. The fire is trying to be pushed down slope by these winds, and you can see there's some smoldering fire all the way up here on the mountain. The most concerning bit of the fire is probably right here, because of its potential to sort of move in this direction with the wind. But right now, it doesn't look too crazy. I'm not seeing a very dense smoke plume, but this could change at any moment. So if you're keeping an eye on the cameras, this is the one to watch, and this is the area where I would be concerned about potential development. If this thing is going to blow up today and wreak havoc, that's probably where it would begin from, moving downslope with, again, there's a mountain wave with air going like this. And it could be up to 50, 60 locally higher gusts. So going to keep a close eye on that, but right now it does not look too bad. Fingers crossed it stays that way. Okay, and one other thing to take a look at is the longer term ensemble. So if I pull up the trusty European model ensemble, so this is where we are right now. This is the system that's coming in. This is a bit of an inside slider, as I mentioned. It could bring a few showers to the northern Sierra, nothing really anywhere else. But this is bringing the strong winds in the Reno area, and it's also bringing to a lesser extent the strong winds down by the bridge fire in Southern California. This moves inland. A ridge tries to build back in weakly, but doesn't really make it. Before this weekend, we get a new trough, maybe a new low pressure system somewhere over California. This one may be a little bit farther west, so that other one sort of took this trajectory. Right now the models are leaning towards this one being sort of a coast hugger in that capacity, although there's uncertainty. There's some individual model members that bring it more offshore. That would bring increase the chance of showers over northern central California. There's others that bring it in more inland, which would be more favored track for September, but the weather does what it wants. That would be more of an offshore wind event for this portion of California. So the exact trajectory, whether it does inside slider or outside slider, or right along the coast, sort of bring a mix of a few showers and some wind, will really affect how much fire risk there is this weekend as the system moves through. That may be followed by something that looks more like an inside slider once again. So as we go towards mid-September, there is a bit of an offshore wind signal. Before, as we go toward the end of the month, it does look like ridging will try and build back in. Not super strongly, but this would bring a return of above average temperatures and no offshore wind events nor any precipitation events. So European model ensemble ends up showing warmer than average temperatures, but not extremely so across the west. You pull over to the American ensemble, the equivalent, looks a little bit different, where we go from this cooler interlude, taking a look at accumulated precipitation, again showing that there is a decent chance of some soaking rain along the north coast and maybe the Shasta Mountains, the Northern Sierra, probably not anywhere else in California, although there's a chance, depending on how things go. European model, again, showing essentially the same picture. No widespread significant precipitation outside of perhaps the far north coast, but the potential for a few showers elsewhere depending on how this evolves. So a mix of scattered showers versus offshore wind events is a pretty classic question in September and October. The likelihood of a season-ending rainfall is near zero from anything that's on the horizon right now, but there could be some showers in a few places that might be nice to see. Okay, so I'm going to go stop sharing my screen and take a look at the questions. All right, here. So what have we got? Comment from the Redwood Coast that there's some clouds, a bit of rain, although relatively mild. That makes sense with this pattern. A number of folks mentioning that the photos of the fires are pretty wild, and they are indeed. No argument there. Loretta mentions that there are some swirling winds in Half Moon Bay. That makes sense. The Bay Area, as I mentioned yesterday, will see some pretty gusty winds, 30, 40, maybe even locally 50 miles an hour on the ridges and along the immediate coast. These would be northwesterly winds, so they're not hot, dry offshore winds. They're relatively moist but strong onshore winds. Not famous for bringing the highest risk of fires, but could still bring some fire risk if there's an ignition just because vegetation is really dry. It's not going to rain, so strong winds and dry vegetation, even if it's relatively cool and not super dry in the air, you can still see significant fire spread. It's a little bit harder than a hot, dry wind event, but the risk is there. No red flag warning in effect, but probably a good day not to do outdoor activities that would cause sparks in the dry vegetation. I'll just put it that way. There's a few questions. I'm going to come back to the question about fire front following firefighting tactics, but I'm going to jump ahead right now to the potential for medium range threat to Cajon Pass from the bridge fire. You know, honestly, anything is possible if there's a contiguous fuel bed between where the fire is now and where you're talking about, so I guess theoretically, yes. You'd have to get pretty far, although the winds this afternoon and tonight are going to push it in that direction. It won't get there today, it's just too far, but the winds today could start to get it moving in that direction once again. So there's a lot of land there. It would become a really enormous fire if it were to be encompassed by that full range. But, it's hard to say never when we continue to see these wildfires do these 50,000, 100,000 acre runs in a single day, these 10-mile runs in a 12-hour period, 15-mile runs in some cases. If we were to get another strong onshore wind event, then not completely outside the realm of possibility, I guess, but it's pretty hard to make those kinds of predictions because that's a function both of the weather, the firefighting, and a lot of other things too. Okay, so there's a question from Galactic Republic about fire front following and its context in the bridge fire last night. So I mentioned in a tweet last night from some folks who were on the ground, some of the footage they were showing, and some of the radio traffic suggesting that the relatively limited firefighting resources that were on the ground in Wrightwood were feeling like they were overwhelmed and outflanked, so that they couldn't address every spot fire that was popping up. This crown fire, so running through the trees at a high intensity right above town, was dropping billions probably of embers on the town. Each flaming tree generates many thousands of embers over the course of its combustion process, and a lot of those were raining down on the town and starting spot fires. So some of them ignited people's houses, some of them ignited dry brush in town, or people's cars, as the case may be. All of those individual ignitions initially are, of course, small until they aren't. And it was dry and windy in town, so each of those individual spot fires had the potential to grow. And as this fire front was moving through pretty quickly and aggressively, it's not always safe for firefighters to remain immediately in front of it. And so in that setting where you're not trying to save everything, and you can't save every structure, you can't save. So your first priority is to get people out, and once you've accomplished that, is to make brief stances trying to hold individual structures. So you might retreat a little bit as the fire moves forward, move up the road, park your vehicles, get out your equipment, try and get out. You probably don't have a major hose line, you don't have time to set one up, but you might just be trying to dig around individual spot fires, or use the water that's actually in the truck to try and put out small spots. Trying to, if someone's deck catches on fire, trying to get some water on it before it reaches the rest of the house. But you don't spend hours making 100% sure that fire doesn't pop back up. You just throw some water on it in a couple of minutes, and then you move on to the next thing. You do your best, and if you had, hundreds and hundreds of fire engines and hundreds of personnel, you could have somebody doing that at every property, at every house. Every spot fire could individually be picked up, hopefully. But in a situation like this, where there's dozens and dozens of spot fires, with a major fire front moving into a town with hundreds of structures, and only a couple dozen firefighters on the scene at the time, there's only so much that you can do. And so that fire front following, you don't want to be in the thick of the front. You stay just in front of it. You try and take care of the spots that you can, but you try and stay outside of the most dangerous zone. And it's essentially triage. It's firefighting triage when you have a wildland fire that moves into a wildland urban interface, or the intermix settings, so where there's vegetation intermixed with the structures. That can sometimes be a tactic used if you can't save everything, but you do the best you can with limited resources, and ideally without putting firefighting personnel into grave danger. For what might well be a lost cause to a certain extent anyway. That's the tactic. It seemed to have worked relatively well given the circumstances, the limited resources. As I mentioned, this was not a total loss for the town, despite the fact that it very well could have been given the conditions, and there were extensive structural losses that I don't have any further insight on beyond what's available publicly, but it's pretty clear that it was bad but could have been even worse. And the town is not out of harm's way yet. The fire is still around the town, and it's windy and active right now, but it's got a better fighting chance today because there's more resources on the ground, so they don't have to follow that triage approach of fire front following. Okay, so I want to take a look at a few things before we go. I'm going to share my screen again briefly because there are a number of folks who would like to see the satellite. This is again for Southern California. It doesn't look too dramatically different, although the line fire really is picking up, and you can see the bridge fire trying to pick up as well. Looking at the thermal signature, sometimes it's easier to tell how things are changing. It does look like the line fire is really starting to pick up a head of steam once again, but actually all three fires have become a little more pronounced on the thermal satellite imagery, even in the hour that I've been talking. And then I'll hop over to watch duty Take another check on Reno. This is what we see, roughly the same picture as we saw earlier. So it's still burning and it's still in a precarious location hung up above town, but I think the retardant that was laid down earlier is doing its job for now. Fingers crossed it stays that way despite the severe wind event and particularly dangerous red flag warning in effect right now. So that's the picture we get from this. Go back to Southern California, take a look at some of the cameras, because there are, as folks were mentioning, there is that new fire, the Joshua fire. I'll take a look at it again, see how it looks. This one's actually already looking better, so my guess is there's a decent chance they catch this one before it gets into heavier brush, so perhaps we won't have to worry about this one too much, but keep an eye on it if you're nearby. This is the bridge fire, of course. These are images from yesterday, actually, on some of the cameras. These are cameras that did not make it through the fire. You can see these in the last images. This one's still online, though. You can still see the area is kind of smoked in, but the camera is still online. Look at a different direction. It's kind of the same picture there. A lot of smoke around, kind of hard to see what's going on. That's just a picture of some brush. But you get a sense of what the brush is like right now. It's very dense and very dry. That's a lot of what's burning right now. Okay, so this camera is still online even though the fire is right on its doorstep. And you can kind of see that if you put this into motion. You can see that there's active smoke rising pretty close to this. Here too, smoke rising as well. Well, let's see if we can get a better view. Again, this is now the line fire. This is looking southwest from above Big Bear. This is from the lake itself, so it's looking a little ugly there. This one is actually closer to the fire. If we pull this up, and you can see the landscape that's potentially at risk here, that's potentially going to burn as this fire moves north and east. Here's the 2-hour loop. And let's see if I'm going to fast forward. It's pretty much just smoke. Visibility is bad. It's getting smoked out. So not a lot to see there. But again, this fire is very active on its eastern flank, and this is now posing a direct threat, potentially to parts of the Big Bear area as soon as this afternoon and this evening. All right, so that is pretty much all I've got for you right now. It's a little bit calmer this time today than it was this time yesterday, which is good. But there is a significant wind event in Southern California and in Western Nevada, and that could cause things to blow up in the next few hours. I do think if we make it through today without any major big blow-ups, that'll be good news. But the Southern California fires in particular are not going to be contained or extinguished anytime soon. They'll likely burn for weeks. So if there are any further adverse weather events in the weeks to come, especially offshore winds, that could be a problem. So we'll stay tuned for that. Up in Western Nevada by the the Davis fire, I do think that if we get through this evening and overnight hours without a big blow-up, that they'll probably be able to make a lot of progress on that over the next few days as temperatures cool down and as winds decrease with some increased humidity up there. And that one might be buttoned up sooner rather than later. It helps that it's a smaller fire. 6,000 acres might sound large, but compared to the 450,000 acre park fire, or even the current fires in Southern California, which are in the tens of thousands of acres, it's relatively modest, and the eastern flank is already pretty well buttoned up. So the Southern California fires are the big story right now, as well as ongoing fire activity up in places like Idaho and Montana and Wyoming. So I might be able to call it a slightly early session today. Thanks for joining, as always. For those of you who haven't subscribed, I would strongly encourage you to do so. And something that everybody can do is like these videos as they come in. I know it still feels odd to be saying these things and encouraging folks to like this channel, but believe it or not, it makes a really big difference in terms of who sees this and how far and wide these sessions get broadcast. So thanks, as always, for your support. Stay safe out there. I know there are probably some folks watching who are in evacuated zones and may remain so for some time. So the only good news is that right now, after we get through today, I don't foresee any extreme fire weather events on the immediate horizon at this point. So we'll have to take it one day at a time for now, but after today, things will look somewhat better. All right. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.